To chart a curve for knitting, you need a graph paper or a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet. And I'm going to show you how to do that now. I've got my WPS Office spreadsheet open. You can use an Excel spreadsheet also. And the spreadsheet shows you a grid, but the width of the columns in the grid are wider than I need. So I need to make them into a square shape. So to do that, I'm going to select all the cells in this sheet by clicking on the top left corner here. And then I'm going to come to my rows and columns menu, and I'm going to adjust my row height and my column width. So you can simply adjust your column width to make it square, which you can do by clicking there and changing this number to 3. And it gives you a grid like graph paper. The cells are all square. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to use your gauge to adjust the row height and the column width, because that gives you a grid that is more like you're knitting. Because when you're knitting, your gauge isn't square. Your gauge isn't usually 7 stitches equal to an inch and 7 rows equal to an inch. No, it's not square. So if you use your gauge to adjust the grid, it gives you a more realistic picture of your work. Okay, so how to do that? Um, you would need your calculator, and I have mine here. So you would go to your calculator and you would divide your gauge by, you would divide your gauge, you take 1 and divide your gauge by it. So usually, let's say I have 7 stitches in an inch. In order to know what my width should be, my column width should be, I will take that stitch gauge, 7 stitches in an inch. I'll go and say 1 divided by 7, and the answer is 0.14. We're just taking the first 2 digits after the decimal, so 0.14. That's what my column width should be. So I'm coming back here and clicking to select all the cells, and then row and column width. I'm going to come and type in 0.14, and make sure you change this to inches. So this is the width corresponding to my gauge. And then we need to also adjust the row heights. So I'm going to go back to my calculator, and let's say my gauge is 12 rows in an inch. I'm going to use the row gauge for the row height. So 12 rows in an inch, I'm going to say 1 divided by 12. That's going to give me 0.08. Okay, so I'll come back here, select all my cells, click on rows and columns, and click on row height and adjust it to 0.08, and make sure that this is inches, and click on OK. So everything has been adjusted to my gauge now. And if I zoom in, it's not quite square, and that's what we want. Now the next thing is to select the area that I really need. My sheet contains a lot of cells, but I don't need all of them. Need to I just need the width that accommodates the number of stitches I'm reducing. So let's say I'm decreasing 12 stitches. So I need a width of 12 columns, which ends here. That's the width I need. And also let's say I'm decreasing over 12 rows. So I'm going to come and select 12 rows. 1, 2, 3 to 12. So this is the area I need to chart my decrease curve in. So if you're using graph paper, you take your graph paper and you draw a box around the area that you really need for your decreasing. The number of stitches is the width, and the number of rows you are decreasing over is the height. So I'm going to come here and select all the boxes in this area so I can see clearly where to draw my curve. Next, I'm going to come to insert and I want to draw a shape, a curve. So I'm going to come to shapes and choose scribble, okay, or free form. I think scribble is better. Gives me a pencil tool and then I can just draw a curve from there like that. It's not the smoothest curve, but it gives me an idea of the number of stitches I should be taking off in order to create this sort of curve. So if I wanted my curve to be flatter, I would draw a flatter curve like this before going up. For example, I would come and do this instead. So depends on what you want. That will determine the kind of curve you draw, and that will determine how many stitches you will be reducing as you knit. So let me delete one of them and let's deal with just this one. Now that we have this curve, what I like to do is shade the boxes that the curve passes through, because that's the number of stitches that I will be decreasing as I knit. So I'm going to come and click on fill color. Make sure I've selected the box that I want to shade. So my curve passes through this box and then it also passes through this box, and it doesn't pass through this one, but when you're knitting an armhole, for example, you are going to have the carriage on one edge after every 2 rows, because you knit this way 1 row and then you knit back second row. That's when you will have the carriage back at this edge to reduce. So for one of those rows, you won't be able to reduce unless you have an extra string of yarn. So I like to do my decreases over 2 rows. So I look at where the curve is passing through over 2 rows, not just 1 row. So, and then I select that on a single row because that's really where I can decrease. So this curve passes through this stitch on the second row. So I'm going to select here too, and I'm going to color it black. Or let me use another color so we can still see the lines. So what this means, what I've done here is for the first 2 rows, I'm going to decrease 3 stitches. I'm going to bind off 3 stitches. Then I'm going to knit 2 rows, 1, 2. Now I'm back here, and for the next 2 rows, my curve passes through this stitch and this stitch, and on this row it passes through this stitch. So I'm going to select this stitch and I'm going to color it in. Okay, so first 2 rows I reduce 3 stitches. Next 2 rows I take out 3 stitches also. Then in this set of stitches, the curve passes through. Oh, see, my curve actually does pass through this stitch also for this set of rows, these 2 rows. So I'm going to color that in also. It passes through 4 stitches. So 3, 4, and then for the next set of rows, my curve passes through this stitch and this stitch. So I'm going to color that in. And then for the next set of rows, my curve passes through this stitch and this stitch. Okay. And then after that, my curve basically passes through one stitch, I'm coloring that in. for these 2 rows, and then it passes through 1 stitch. So that's the trajectory of my curve. So that's how I'm going to decrease. Let me delete this curve so that we can get a better view of what I've done. So what this means, if I were to write it out, is over here, I'm going to reduce 3 stitches in 2 rows. And then up here, I'm going to reduce 4 stitches in 2 rows. Let me make my font smaller so that you can see it better. And then up here, I'm going to reduce 2 stitches in 2 rows. And up here, I'm going to also reduce 2 stitches in 2 rows. And then up here, it's going to be reduce 1 stitch in 2 rows. And the last one will also be reduce 1 stitch in 2 rows. So this is my instruction for reducing, for doing this decrease for this armhole shaping. And bear in mind that this isn't a hard and fast standard. You can change it depending on how you want your curve to be. For example, I could say that it looks a bit awkward to have 3 stitches, reduce, then come and reduce 4 stitches, then go and reduce 2 stitches. It looks a bit funny. So I could say, no, I'm going to take this out, and instead of reducing 4 stitches here, I'm going to reduce 4 stitches first, and then reduce 3 stitches, then 2 stitches, then 2 stitches, and 1 stitch and 1 stitch. Looks more like a staircase, like a step-by-step gradual reduction. I don't know if that makes sense. But the point is that you can chart the curve, chart the curve as you please. It could be a steeper curve, it could be a gentler curve. Okay, the important thing is that the curve covers the width. You have the number of stitches that you need to reduce charted, and you have charted it over the number of rows that you need to decrease over. And you've taken note of how many stitches you are reducing in how many rows. These are the important factors to bear in mind.